All right, everyone. So today we're going to talk about the adaptive modifications to insect mouthparts for lifestyles that don't include chewing. So this is the generalized insect mouth, again, of Orthoptera. This should be the last time we look at this. And we have the labrum, the mandibles, the maxillae down here, and then the labium. So this is the general structure for insects that bite and chew, and that is the majority of insects, I think. But there are a large number of insects that are liquid feeders. So they require considerable modification in order to feed on liquid. And how they've gone about achieving this is different for each group. But we'll start with bees because they're pretty neat. So with bees, they have both mandibles and a tongue that allows them to siphon liquid. So the mandibles are here. Let's go some lighter color so it's a little easier to see. So these are the mandibles here. They still have sickle-shaped mandibles, or not sickle-shaped, but triangular mandibles, because most bees either are leaf cutting or they feed on pollen to get protein and fat. So like honeybees don't just drink nectar and drink honey, they also feed on pollen. So the mandibles are used to chew the pollen or make these things called bee cakes for their larvae. But they also have this tongue which they make from the labium. And although this is pointing to the labium, these are actually the glossae. So if you remember, I talked about the glossa and the paraglossa. The two glossa, or the glossae, fuse into this tongue-like structure. And then at the end of it is something called the flabellum, which is used to actually suck stuff up. This is the flabellum. These are the labial palps on the side, still intact. Up here on the drawing, you can see them. These are the paraglossa. And then there are the maxilla forms the other part of this tongue. So on this picture, the maxilla are these white pieces on the side, and these are actually the galea of the maxilla. So these are the galea. If you remember, we talked about the galea and the lacinia. The galea are the outer lobes of the maxilla. So that is used to form the outside of this sheath tongue. And how this works, let me get a blank page so you can see a drawing of this. How this works is that the the maxillae and the labium form a channel, like a straw. Let me make sure that in which they can inject saliva and suck up liquids. And it's a layered construct. So these inner layers are the glossae. So these two here are the glossae from the labium, which form the center of this channel. And in the middle here, this is where saliva is. And food comes up this outer channel. So these are two. These two larger pieces are the galea of the maxilla. So these are the glossae of the labium. And then down here, these two are the labial palps. And they can kind of collapse these in on themselves and form this straw. This cross-section, there are variations of it, but this is the generalized cross-section of how insects form stylets. So it's usually two pieces coming together to form a straw. The next group that does something similar are butterflies and moths. So butterflies and moths, adults are all liquid feeders, but as caterpillars, they're primarily leaf feeders, although they do feed on other things like fruit. So the caterpillars have very strong mandibles, but the adult butterflies generally lose their mandibles. So the mandibles are either completely lost or are what would you say, reduced to the point of no longer functioning. What you do see on the front of butterflies are these enlarged labial palps, and this is labeled as the maxilla. These specifically, these are the galea of the maxilla. And once again, let me show you a cross section of this. And this is the galea is what forms the proboscis. So the proboscis, if you look at it in cross section, so on the outside, let me go to black. On the outside, it looks like a little curlicue that's attached to the butterfly head, and it has these enormous labial palps. If you were to cut that in half, what you would see are, again, this straw-like structure. And these are the galea. Really, really long galea. And we could go through all the nerves and stuff, but we're not going to do that. But there are muscles that run through this galea in order to control it and furl it and unfurl it. So that is how butterflies feed. And this is kind of an interesting point. It's not just for nectar, but there are also vampiric moths, so they could also use this for blood feeding, in which case it usually has like a sharpened tip, sometimes with metal embedded and things like that. The next insect group I talked about the other day, these are the Neuroptera, or the lacewings. So these are green lacewings, antlions, and owlflies, things like that. These are their larvae. They don't look anything like the adults. They're very strange looking, but they have these enormous mandibles. They are predatory, but also liquid feeders. They have these massive sickle-shaped mandibles, and their maxilla, so this is the mandible, and the maxilla sits on the inside. The mandible is hollowed out, the maxilla sits on the inside and forms a channel, and they use this to pierce their prey, inject digestive fluids, and suck out the delicious juices, and that's how the entire group tends to feed. So I talked about this the other day when I was talking about mandibular modifications. So this isn't particularly new, but we'll move on to the next one. So this one is the mouth parts of a flea, the Siphonoptera. This is the eye. So fleas are blood feeders, so they have to pierce the skin somehow. Number one here is the eye. Number 6 here. These are the maxillae. 5 are the maxillary palps. Number 2 are the labial palps. This is a hot mess of a picture. Number 4 is the epipharynx, which, if you remember back to the labrum, the epipharynx is a kind of a not always present lobe inside the mouth behind the labrum. And number 3 are the maxillary laciniae. So these are the lacinia. Am I going to spell this right? Laciniae, I-A-E, which again are the inner lobes of the maxilla. So these assemble, these kind of collapse in on themselves to form a food channel. Okay, so this is a relatively complicated stylet. On the interior, you have the channel, just like you always do. And this is formed, let's see, so food goes here, or in this case, blood. And this is the epipharynx, the thinnest part of that channel that you saw in the other drawing. Around the epipharynx, the lacinia stabilize it. So these are the lacinia. Around the lacinia, the labial palps stabilize that. And then around the labial palps, the large maxillae And this is not a good cross-section of the maxillae, but these are the maxillae. Stabilize that. And on top of them, you have the maxillary palps. So it assembles in order to pierce the skin and then just to get the blood to come through the center here. So it's a very delicate, complicated structure. So next are the flies, and honestly there could be an entire video just on fly mouths. All of the flies have a weird either sponging mouthpart or piercing sucking mouthpart. So piercing sucking being like a mosquito and sponging being like a housefly. But they all require kind of a stylet setup in order to work. And although mosquitoes have very complicated mouthparts, the general structure of a fly mouthpart is fairly straightforward. So down here, this is a new structure called the labellum. And the labellum is a sensory organ on the end of the labium that they use to taste for the most part. So the outside of this is held together by the labium. This outside sheath holding the stylet together is the labium. And how it looks on the inside is you have a large sheath of the labium, and then the top part of this sheath is made up of the labrum, and then the inner part of this is made up of the hypopharynx. And the hypopharynx, if you'll remember, is kind of like the tongue, is the tongue-like structure inside the preoral cavity that's generally attached to the labium, and this is where you get the food coming through. Almost there. The final group that we need to talk about are modifications for the hemiptera. So these are the true bugs, and they all have this piercing, sucking mouth, either facing backwards or facing down. This is the cicada here, and it has this needle-like mouth. And they all kind of, I shouldn't say all of them. I really shouldn't say all when talking about anything with insects. There's millions of species, so there's always an exception. But this stylet is primarily made up of the mandibles and the maxilla. So how the stylets work is you have a very large labium. This is the labium, and acts as the outer sheath. Inside, you have mandibles and the maxillae. So you kind of have a supporting structure on each side formed by the maxillae. And then inside that is where the mandibles form the food and salivary channels. So these are the mandibles. And each of these, one of these is for food, and the other one is for saliva. And these are, again, primarily plant feeders, so they're actually sucking up the sap out of plants, although there are predatory versions of these, like the assassin bugs, which will use this same structure to pierce into other insects and feed on their blood that way, or their hemolymph that way. Okay, so there are still other variations. So like the Thysanoptera have their own rasping mouthparts, rasping, sucking mouthparts. Mosquitoes have complicated stylet. Every sort of insect group has a slight modification if they're not just chewing. And as we saw with the chewing mouthparts, there are even lots of modifications with that. So depending on what you're interested in, you should look at the actual mouthparts of that specific insect in order to get a better understanding of how it feeds. These are just kind of the generalized structures. Okay, next time we'll move on to the thorax. I think we're done with the head for now. I'm going to save the eyes and the ocelli for when we talk about the nervous system, since they're basically just big masses of nerve cells. So we'll move on to the thorax, talk about the thorax structure, the legs, and the wings. Okay, thanks.